Good evening, welcome to my channel again. Once more I have a story that's not based on random words. I know, I hear you say, what is happening to me? But this story was actually written for a little gathering of friends, and the idea was to write a sort of seasonal M.R. James style ghost story. So I came up with an idea, just popped into my head, and I'm going to read you that story today. It's a little bit longer than usual, but I think you'll enjoy it if you like a kind of spooky Victorian ghost story. And as ever, if you do enjoy it, I would very much appreciate it if you would share this video. Doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's very appreciated. And or you can like it or leave a comment. Hopefully I'll one day grow this channel to something approaching visibility. Anyway, this story is called The Sanctified Shard. As the train clattered slowly toward the station at Tunbury, a cloud of steam from the engine 3 carriages ahead dissipated to reveal a frosty idyll. This December was like no other I'd ever experienced, crisp, shimmeringly bright, and imbued with an air of expectant promise. I'd just turned 24 and had been tasked with my first solo project, attempting to accurately date the rose window at Tunbury Cathedral. I would be using a combination of microscopy, forensic investigation, and a thorough combing of the cathedral records. Professor Angus Cruikshank of the University of Edinburgh had recently opined that the 9 leaves making up the unique rose at the front of the chancel might predate the Norman conquest. My PhD supervisor, Dr. Henry Wadham, thought this was highly unlikely and felt it important that I investigate the provenance of the panes prior to the publication of my study of Middle Ages cathedral design. I'd already had a hankering to add Tunbury to the list of cathedrals I'd personally toured, so I eagerly got in touch with the Archbishop to arrange a visit. If I could complete my examination by the end of 1890, I might be able to publish by the following autumn, following the usual round of peer review and assessment. This, at least, was my scheme. The cathedral appeared beyond the meadows, which were filled with an almost ethereal bed of low-lying mist. Its spire and towers dominated the landscape and inspired just as much awe in our Victorian era as it must have done as our ancestors ended their pilgrimages here. Tunbury itself proved to be a pleasingly quaint town, not much larger than Ely, which I'd visited in the summer. Its cobbled lanes and crookedly leaning Tudor buildings made me half expect a hunting party led by the inestimable Henry to ride into the courtyard of the little inn in which I would be staying during my week-long inquiries. Fortunately, no such boisterousness disturbed my first evening at the Willow Inn, which was spent reading and playing draughts with Mr. Eddington, a naturalist come to study rare varieties of toad in the marshes. The following morning, with several hours to spare before my 11 a.m. meeting with the Archbishop, I popped into the local telegraph office to send a message home to my wife Millie. Reached Tunbury, cathedral impressive, rooms comfortable, seeing Arch this a.m., love, P. The P stood for Peter, my Christian name, and I hoped the Almighty would forgive me abbreviating his Tunbury representative. With my meagre academic stipend and a charge of a halfpenny a letter, it seemed a reasonable accommodation. Task complete, I then went for a stroll across the meadows, following a bridle path suggested to me by Mr. Eddington, who discovered it just the other day. Beginning with a narrow lane lined with flinty walls, the path opened out into a dusty strip buttressed by hawthorn hedges which snaked up a gentle hillside. Gentle at first, I should say, for after 20 minutes of marching and finding myself frustrated in my desire for a view by the tall hedges on either side, the way began to incline exponentially and narrow, leading me into a dense wood of spindly birches and alders. Even on this winter morning, with the sun low and occluded by thin clouds, I was soon sweating in my tweed 3-piece and overcoat. I took off my gloves and scarf and stuffed them into the haversack in which I kept my instruments and notebook. Under the trees it was mercifully cooler, and I stomped up a rocky trail whose mud was fortunately frozen solid, offering purchase for my decidedly inappropriate brogues. I made a mental note to buy some decent boots in town. A few minutes later, my fervent wish for a vista was granted, as the path levelled, then burst from the trees into a sloping meadow of astonishing beauty. A gleaming river wormed its way across the valley floor, between rutted fields of ploughed earth and intermittent rectangles of corn stubble and still green grass. The sun shone between distant trees, illuminating patches of frost which glittered like diamond dust. Gnarled trees punctuated the scene, grasping at the pale sky. A murder of crows chattered darkly as they hopped amongst the corn stalks. To my right, the cathedral's tower asserted its dominance. How remarkable that I'd be employed there in a matter of hours, making discoveries of potentially historic import. I felt a sudden pang that my beloved Millie couldn't be with me to revel in such a scene. Millicent, a schoolteacher, was very much with child, our first, and unable to travel due to her frequent bouts of nausea. The fields to my left, below which the river wound, were bordered by a wooden fence which had seen better days. A line of crows perched upon it, eyeing me with suspicion. A moment of dasped inspiration made me doff my Homburg to them. I looked around for witnesses to my silliness. Fortunately, there were none. My glance alighted upon an angled stone in the middle of a distant field, the bottom of which was lost in still lingering morning mist. I'd heard there were Paleolithic standing stones in the vicinity, a half-crumbled circle and a series of lone menhirs. Could this be one of them? As there were no other pedestrians, and because I couldn't really see the harm of it, I clambered over a partially collapsed section of fence and tiptoed into the frost-hardened field, picking my way between the muddy striations. I was only a little disappointed when, a few hundred yards later, I stood face to face with a simple, albeit elongated, headstone, too decrepit to bear more than a trace of lettering. Not prehistoric, but possibly medieval in origin? Could it be a mile marker for some long-forgotten footway? "There's the grave of the Master of Tunbury," a voice cried out. I started. A fellow had appeared upon a pony on the lane above me. I squinted against the sunlight to make him out. I'm sorry, I just wanted to take a look." I headed back up towards the bridle path, and the stranger was quickly revealed to be a rustic type, possibly a farmer, chewing on a cornstalk as if he'd wandered into the scene from a constable painting. "No harm in looking," he opined, "just so long as you ain't no relative." "Relative?" I inquired, trying to clamber back over the fence with my dignity and gentleman's quarters intact. "The master, Duke of Tunbury as was, used to have his mansion here, down by the water." "Oh, really?" I asked, more intrigued than embarrassed now. "Yes, that were in 16 Oatcake, mind. I'm not handy with the specifics, but him had his house burnt down by locals, some say." "Why on earth would they do that?" "Said he was damned, or summat. He had a heart attack and died in his study. So I hears. They buried him under that stone, wrote only his first name, John, and left him to his lady's mercy." "His what?" I was genuinely perplexed by this sinister tale, particularly as the teller appeared to grow increasingly self-conscious as he related it, looking around him as if the crows might gossip about his loose tongue. "I've said too much, as usual, and I'm late for country fair. Ben Maddox at your service." He took off his cloth cap and gave a stiff little bow, while his nag squinted at me with undisguised loathing, snorting foul-smelling clouds of equine breath in my direction. "Peter Pritchard, at yours," I remarked, as he rode unsteadily off. I watched the farmer recede over the brow of the hill, then turned to look back into the meadow. Beyond the stone, a small patch of mist seemed to cling to a bend in the river. Protruding from this reticent cloud were the fingers of a particularly damaged tree, which leaned over the unseen water as if in supplication. It was the only tree in the vicinity, and from where I stood, I couldn't tell whether it was naked from wintering or from death. A moment of panic seized me. I looked at my pocket watch. 10:25. I was going to be late for the Archbishop if I didn't continue apace. That wouldn't do at all. "Here is a remarkable rose," said Archbishop Adam Munsey with a grandiloquent gesture. I followed his hand up to the brightly illuminated circle of leaf-shaped panes, each decorated with complex leaded patterns in many colours, depicting the martyrdom of saints and the trials and teachings of the Christ. The window was fully 40 feet in diameter and situated at least 80 feet above the flagstones. Fortunately, the trapezoid chancel was lined with a raised wooden gallery which afforded cathedral workers the opportunity to inspect and clean the glass. The Archbishop, despite his 70-plus years, lifted the hem of his robe and nimbly climbed the spiral stair leading to this walkway, as I cautiously followed. The morning service had ended some time prior, and the cathedral was empty, save a few tourists and a pastor collecting discarded hymnals. Our voices echoed magnificently from the limestone surfaces. "I'm so looking forward to finding out more about our glass," I believe it's a source of some controversy, the Archbishop said, stepping back to let me pass and inspect the glowing circle that towered above me. There are competing theories, I replied, giving my most politic response. I'll know more once I inspect it closely. I stood on tiptoes and was barely able to get my eyes near to the surface of the lowest pane, which depicted Mary Magdalene washing the feet of Jesus. The pale blue glass depicting Mary's robes was laid in a series of triangular slices, beautifully capturing the falling folds of cloth. We have ladders and even a wheeled scaffold, offered the Archbishop, although you want to inspect the latter closely before you commit. It's not been used in an age. I thanked the prelate, whose face in that moment was lit in a beatific glow of late morning sunlight, coloured in pink and gold. Munsey led me to a concealed closet where a stout set of tall stepladders were stationed. I have no great fear of heights, but their modern build reassured me nonetheless. With these I'd be able to reach the centre of the pane, at the very least. Munsey kindly offered me a young chorister, Anthony, to assist, and we stationed the ladders beneath the rows and laid out my equipment on a fold-out trestle table nearby. Anthony, it transpired, was shy, to the extent of being near mute, which suited me fine. I'm not one for loquacity while I'm working. Instead of needlessly prattling, my attentive assistant passed me tools and instruments like a nurse attending an operation. Indeed, this was a delicate procedure, since this window rose was quite precious, whatever its provenance. Some of the panes had come a little loose from their leading, which allowed me to insert a small scraping tool between frame and pane and extract tiny fragments of glass which I might examine under my microscope later. With an ordinary magnifying glass, it was already evident that some of this glass was much older than the bulk of the panes, which I estimated dated from the 14th century. From the nature of the dyeing, the smoothness of the glass, and the presence of evident layering and air bubbles, I was able to identify several leaves dating much further back, potentially to the mid-11th century. The process was engrossing but intricate and time-consuming. I took copious notes, having sketched the window first, so that I could annotate each pane with its putative date. I was so captivated by my task that I hardly noted Anthony excusing himself and leaving, or the weather beyond the window changing. From a clear, crisp winter's day, the afternoon progressed into a darkening storm, whose rain blattered against the panes, and whose winds howled around the cathedral, making it seem inhabited by banshees. There were no afternoon or evening services scheduled today, so I felt quite alone, save these mysterious and distant wailings, which I reminded myself were not supernatural in nature, but simply the result of wind blowing through buttresses and across exterior statuary. I was concentrating so hard that it was only when I had to squint to see through the glass and the first flash of distant lightning illuminated my perch that I realised it had got considerably darker and much later. My watch informed me it was almost 5 p.m. Crash! There was another fork of divine electricity with its attendant rumble as the gathering storm drew closer. I realised that it might not be sensible to be balancing so high above the ground in front of an electricity-conducting metal frame, and began to climb down. In the next moment, my worry was vindicated. A terrifying blast landed on the cathedral's chancel, perhaps drawn by the conductor that stretched high above the tower. A finger of fire must have jumped between the metal pole and the window, for the many tormented faces of Christ lit up suddenly above me, and a shattering occurred near the centre of the rows. In fear, I fell from the ladder as shards of glass cascaded around me. Miraculously, I landed upon a bundled ground sheet and suffered only bruised elbows and a slight graze to my left cheek. I turned my head, hearing the sound of footsteps running across the flagstones, Archbishop Munsey and Fenton the parson, then looked directly through a blue shard which had embedded itself in the wooden flooring an inch or two away from my face. A fraction closer and I might have been impaled. As the Archbishop began to ascend the spiral stairs, I found myself pulling this dagger of ancient glass free from the woodwork and secreting it in my inside pocket. There were a few other glass fragments scattered around, and I picked myself up and began to gather these as the prelates approached. We all stood back to examine the rows, which had lost a section about as large as a man's forearm, a blue strip from Mary Magdalene's robe. "Are you okay? We heard the crash. What on earth?" began Munsey, and it took 5 minutes for me to calm him and reassure him that I was unhurt and that the damage to the historic window was comparatively minor and could be repaired. I wound the remaining fragments in cloth so that the Archbishop would not notice a shard was missing. I wanted to examine the piece in my lodgings, and I didn't want to trouble him by asking permission. I tried to refuse the Archbishop's offer of hospitality, but he insisted on taking me to dinner in a private room in the adjacent public house, the Crooked Goose. I think he felt a little guilty that I'd come so close to calamity on his premises. He wanted to make amends with shepherd's pie and plum pudding. I took the opportunity as we sipped our ales to ask Munsey about something that had been preying on my mind all afternoon. "Your Excellency." "Adam, please," he admonished gently. "Yes. Well, I've been meaning to ask you about something I encountered on my way to the cathedral. A gravestone, apparently near the site of a long demolished house." "Lord John Hampton, the Black Lord," said Munsey dolefully, "a regrettable part of our local heritage." "Why black? He surely wasn't black in soul and spirit, Mr. Pritchard, a man obsessed with the sins of others and quite blind to his own. He became fascinated with the notion that witches' covens were holding ceremonies in the woods hereabouts." "This was in the 17th century? "That's right. In 1633, his mania came to a sordid conclusion. Having tried and failed to convince his household and the local worthies that there were such creatures at large, Lord John began to feel conspired against. It was said he was making regular sallies to a local house of ill repute, and became fixated with examining the bodies of the poor fallen women who resided there for signs of the devil, additional teats, numerals carved into their hindquarters and such like. Eventually, it was said he was banished from the place, and his obsession turned inwards towards members of his own household. One foggy evening, it said he dragged his own maidservant out of her bed, tied her hands, and took her down to the riverbank. I couldn't believe what the prelate was telling me, aware that I'd been holding a forkful of pudding an inch from my mouth for almost a minute. I pushed the sweet meat aside, agog at Munsey's tale, as he concluded. Lord John next summoned a gardener loyal to his cause. They threw a rope over the limb of a tree, suspended the poor maid by her wrists, and dropped her into the icy torrent several times until she drowned. Then left her corpse swinging in the wind. When the villagers heard of this atrocity, a group of them, including the murdered girl's parents, came with torches and burned Hampton's home to the ground. Fortunately, his wife and 3 children escaped with their lives, but Hampton and 2 of his servants were trapped in an upper room and perished in the conflagration. "Can all this really be true?" I said, astonished by the tale Munsey told, quite straightforwardly and with more embarrassment than emotion. "It's all there in the annals of the parish beadle, if you care to look," Munsey muttered. "We ought to pull that stone down, but some of the parishioners are superstitious and fear they'll be cursed if they remove it." "Who placed it there?" "His wife did, shortly before she left to lead a widow's life in Somerset, I believe the record holds. The day she left, the murdered maid's parents defaced it, removing all but a few traces of the rogue's name." "And the girl?" The Archbishop frowned and seemed to intuit my meaning. "Her name was Nancy Cartwright, scarcely 16 when she died. A senseless and stupid death." I writhed among my sheets that evening, struggling to get to sleep in the remnants of the dissipating storm. The following morning, I rose late and missed Mr. Eddington at breakfast. I decided to replicate my walk of the previous morning. In truth, I felt something drawing me towards that fateful location of despair, madness, and murder. Despite the plentiful puddles the previous evening's storm had created, I made good progress, and it was a little after 10 a.m. when I neared the brow of the hill, where the decrepit fence had granted me access to the field. The rain had softened much of the ploughing, and my shoes and trousers were soon soiled, but it scarcely mattered. Something was leading me inexorably down to the water's edge and that skeletal, supplicant tree. Although a warmer morn than yesterday, still the sheltered bend of river at the base of the valley was swathed in mist once again. It never dissipates, I thought, then wondered why I held this certainty. I gingerly picked my way between the muddy runnels and down to the base of the twisted, broken-backed tree. I couldn't discern its variety, and I have no skill in horticulture, but it looked long dead, whatever it had once been. I looked up and along the trunk to see if I could find a limb overhanging the river. There! One such branch, as thick as a wrestler's thigh, reached out over the torrent, and there was something odd near its extremity, a circular depression in the bark, as if something had constricted its growth, something like a rope. "Sir." The voice, female, more of a whispering croak, issued from behind me. I whirled around, but there was nobody there. I felt suddenly cold and pointlessly fearful. There'd be nobody in the field but me, and no time for anyone to creep up unawares. Clearly my sleep-deprived mind was playing tricks. "Mercy, goodly gentlemen." Again the voice, plainly now, constricted in pain or terror, this time on my other side, somewhere deep in the mist. "Where are you?" I cried, hearing only my voice and the mocking chatter of crows. I felt afraid now. Could it be? Was there something unnatural here with me, in this gloomy place? I remembered I still had the fragment of stained glass in my overcoat pocket. Wrapping my handkerchief around its broad end, I drew it out as a dagger. A loose gleam of sunlight caught its blue surface, and just for an instant I thought I saw a face there, a female visage, contorted. No, it was surely my own, twisted in fear. I spun around as a series of indistinct whispers rose like a fugue of despair. Many voices, or one, somehow duplicated. "What is this?" I cried. "What do you want?" A creak from behind me, a repetitive sound as if something swinging. I turned once more, and there, suspended from the tree's stout limb, swathed in murky mist, was the indistinct figure I'd been dreading, a young woman, hanging. Instinctively I held up my blade, clutching it so tightly that despite my handkerchief, its edge, sheared by the lightning, sliced into my palm. The physical pain helped serve as a concrete distraction from the impossible apparition before me, from which I could not tear my gaze. "Release me," the voice seemed to hiss. What could it mean? I had no means. The agonized form twisted in its misery, now writhing with heightened motion like a whirling zoetrope. I found myself beginning to climb the tree, the glass between my teeth like a savage. In moments I was out on that limb, fiercely hacking at the wood where the rope had cut deep into it. Had anyone seen me, they'd have thought me as crazed as Lord Hampton. Not so crazy, in truth, because after a minute of stabbing at the wood, a final shriek went up and a heavy splash issued from below. Droplets reached me at my perch, but the mist did not allow me to see anything drifting off down the river, and of course nothing could. I'd freed a shade, an incorporeal memory, and nothing more. I jumped from the tree and ran from the field. Muttering to myself, I staggered back towards the cathedral, still clutching the now bloody dagger derived from Mary Magdalene's skirts. On the path I met Mr. Eddington, who'd managed to jar a couple of prime specimens of bufo in the marshy wood nearby. He informed me later that I kept muttering the name of my beloved, Millie, and wouldn't be dissuaded from contacting her immediately. A telegram would not suffice. Fortunately, the Tunbury post office had been supplied with a telephone just a few months prior, and I managed to place a call through to an acquaintance, the manager of the North British Hotel, which is only a short distance from our Newtown flat. My friend kindly tolerated my rantings, then sent a porter running down to Randolph Crescent. There our wonderful midwife Letty was attending my beloved, who appeared to have just given birth, a full 5 weeks early, having suffered quite appalling pains in labour. I felt immediately stricken by guilt that I was not there to witness the emergence of Harold Ignatius Pritchard into the world. I had not been an attendant husband lately, and Millie deserved better. I should be there with her now, I thought. I resolved to leave on the morning train. Tunbury Cathedral would have to wait for an answer to its mysteries. Despite the expense of the call, I insisted Letty put me through to Millie. Once I had her on the line, I finally handed off the bloody handkerchief and shard of blue glass to a concerned Mr. Eddington, who quietly arranged for a physician to attend once I relinquished the receiver. I told Millie I loved her and loved the boy I'd not yet met. Apparently he was asleep at her breast and wore an expression of near cherubic bliss. Millie was too pleased to hear from me to question my addled state of mind. I did not tell her what I'd witnessed in the dismal valley. 10 minutes later, as the local doctor crouched bandaging up my hand, I looked towards the sliver of glass that had set free a traumatized soul, and perhaps saved my own. I suddenly realized how oddly thin and smooth it appeared. Almost like glass from the 16th or perhaps 17th century. "Eddington," I said, "do you know much about Black Lord Hampton and what became of the ruin of his home?" Eddington was standing by the post office window, glancing through the mullioned pane. He seemed to be seeking inspiration in the sloping lane which led up towards the meadows. "Yes, the landlord told me the tale last evening. I think the townsfolk pulled it down and scavenged what they could." It said the town's walls contained some bricks taken from it, and I think some of the painted glass was recovered too. There was a stained window. Oh yes, a seascape, quite fanciful. There's a painting of it in the town archive. I visited this morning. Fascinating place. And what became of the glass? He turned from the sunlit pane, smiling. They don't waste anything hereabouts. I believe some of it made its way into the windows of your cathedral. The end. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that spooky little story. It's quite fun inhabiting the style of a Victorian ghost story writer, and hope you thought I did a decent job. Anyway, as I said, spread the word, say nice things, and I will be back again with a story very soon. Bye-bye.